In the early years of the Pacific War, American Marines noticed something chilling on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. Again and again, whether on the beaches of the Philippines, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, or on tiny volcanic islands scattered across the Pacific, the pattern was the same. When surrounded, cut off, or hopelessly outnumbered, they charged. They fought to the last cartridge. They detonated grenades against their own chests. In some battles, surrender rates were estimated at barely 1%. For American troops, capturing a Japanese soldier alive was so rare it was considered extraordinary. This wasn't just stubborn resistance. It was doctrine. It was culture. It was a belief system so deeply embedded that surrender was seen not merely as defeat, but as disgrace worse than death. The Imperial Japanese Army, shaped by the warrior code of Bushido, and absolute loyalty to Emperor Hirohito, taught its soldiers that capture meant shame for themselves and their families. They were told Americans would torture them, execute them, or parade them as animals. Death, they were told, was honorable. Survival through surrender was unforgivable. But then, something changed. As the war dragged on, and Japan's early victories turned into devastating defeats, a quiet shift began to take place. By 1944 and 1945, in battles like Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, more Japanese soldiers were being taken alive. Not in massive numbers, but enough to be noticed. In some campaigns, surrender rates climbed as high as 15%. For an army once defined by suicidal resistance, that increase was dramatic. What broke the unbreakable? Was it starvation on isolated islands? Was it the slow realization that the empire could not win? Was it American psychological warfare, promising food and medical care instead of torture? Or did faith in the very system that demanded death begin to crumble under the weight of reality? Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most misunderstood transformations of World War II. How an army that once chose death, almost without exception, began, slowly and reluctantly, to choose survival instead, and what that shift reveals about the collapse of Imperial Japan itself. To understand why Japanese surrender rates rose so dramatically as the war progressed, we first have to understand why they were so low to begin with. Long before the first American Marines stormed ashore in the Pacific, the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army had been shaped by a powerful fusion of tradition, nationalism, and military indoctrination. At the heart of it was Bushido, the ancient samurai code, emphasizing loyalty, honor, obedience, and death before disgrace. Although Bushido had evolved over centuries, by the 1930s it had been reshaped by the Japanese state into a modern tool of militarism. Young recruits were taught that the emperor was divine, that Japan's mission in Asia was sacred, and that surrender was not simply a tactical failure but a moral collapse. Military training was intentionally brutal. Recruits were beaten, humiliated, and conditioned to obey without question. Individual survival was secondary to duty. Manuals and field codes explicitly warned that capture was dishonorable. Soldiers were told that if taken prisoner, they would bring shame upon their families back home. In some cases, families of captured men faced social stigma, reinforcing the idea that death was preferable to surrender. Propaganda further strengthened this mindset by portraying Allied forces, particularly Americans, as barbaric and cruel. Stories of torture and execution circulated widely, convincing many Japanese troops that surrender meant certain death or unspeakable suffering. This belief hardened early in the war, when Japan's rapid victories across the Pacific reinforced a sense of invincibility. From the attack on Pearl Harbor to the swift conquests of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced with confidence and momentum. In these early campaigns, surrender was almost non-existent at places like Guam and Wake Island, and later during the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal, surrounded units often launched desperate banzai charges rather than give themselves up. Officers frequently led from the front in suicidal attacks, reinforcing the example expected of their men. Even when isolated, starving, and out of ammunition, many soldiers chose self-destruction over capture. Two American forces, accustomed to European warfare, where surrender was common once positions became untenable. This behavior was shocking. It created a battlefield environment of total resistance, where every cave and trench had to be cleared by force. By 1942 and early 1943, the Japanese never surrender had become an accepted reality on both sides. And yet, beneath this surface of unwavering resolve, the pressures of a long and grinding war were beginning to build. Pressures that would eventually challenge the very foundations of that doctrine. In the early years of the Pacific War, the image of the Japanese soldier was defined by absolute resistance. American troops quickly learned that expecting surrender was often futile. Units surrounded on remote islands would fight until ammunition ran dry, then launch desperate banzai charges, or take their own lives with grenades. This behavior was not random, it was rooted in a carefully cultivated belief system. Soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were taught that surrender meant unbearable shame, not only for themselves, but for their families. Capture was portrayed as a fate worse than death. Many truly believed that American forces would torture or execute them if taken alive. But as the war progressed, cracks began to appear in that rigid worldview. Reports filtered back, sometimes through rumor, sometimes through captured comrades, that prisoners were not automatically killed. They were fed, they received medical care. They were interrogated. Yes, but they survived. This reality directly contradicted years of propaganda. The shock of that discovery planted doubt. Doubt, in an army built on unquestioning obedience, was dangerous. Yet it spread quietly, especially among isolated units cut off from higher command. When survival became a tangible possibility instead of a guaranteed horror, surrender slowly transformed from unthinkable betrayal into a desperate, last-resort option. The myth of inevitable torture began to weaken, and with it, one of the strongest psychological barriers preventing capitulation. As the United States advanced across the Pacific, using its island-hopping strategy, entire Japanese garrisons were bypassed and left stranded. Supply lines collapsed under relentless submarine attacks and air raids. Food shipments never arrived. Ammunition dwindled. Medical supplies disappeared. On islands in New Guinea, the Solomons, and later the Philippines, soldiers who had once been told they were advancing toward glorious victory found themselves trapped in jungles with no reinforcements and no evacuation plan. Starvation became as deadly as American gunfire. Diaries recovered after the war described men eating grass, roots, even insects to survive. Malaria and dysentery ravaged already weakened bodies. Under such conditions, the promise of honorable death in battle gave way to something slower and more terrifying. Prolonged suffering with no purpose. Many soldiers realized they had been abandoned. The imperial command structure that demanded loyalty unto death was nowhere to be found. Communication broke down. Orders stopped coming. Faced with the reality of dying alone in the jungle, some began to question whether sacrifice still held meaning. Survival instincts, suppressed by years of indoctrination. When American forces offered food and medical treatment to those who surrendered, it became a powerful incentive. Starvation has a way of stripping ideology down to its core. For some Japanese soldiers, the choice was no longer between honor and shame. It was between slow, meaningless death and the possibility of living. By 1943 and 1944, Japan's early aura of invincibility had been shattered. The devastating defeat at Midway cost the Imperial Navy for aircraft carriers and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Guadalcanal drained manpower and morale. Later, the massive naval engagement at Leyte Gulf crippled Japan's remaining fleet. Each defeat chipped away at the belief that ultimate victory was assured. Soldiers on the front lines could sense the shift. Air superiority increasingly belonged to the Americans. Supplies grew scarcer. Reinforcements were younger, less trained, and poorly equipped. The introduction of kamikaze tactics in late 1944 symbolized both desperation and devotion, but it also revealed something darker. The High Command was willing to sacrifice its own men in increasingly extreme ways. While some embraced this fanaticism, others quietly recognized it as a sign of collapse. Confidence in leadership began to erode. Officers who once preached certain victory now struggled to explain continuous retreat. Rumors circulated that Japan's cities were being heavily bombed, that civilians were suffering, that industry was faltering. For soldiers cut off on distant islands, the grand narrative of imperial destiny no longer matched reality. Faith, once unshakable, started to fracture, and when faith weakens, so does the willingness to die for it. In that space between propaganda and lived experience, surrender slowly became conceivable. The United States also adapted its tactics as it learned more about its enemy. Early in the war, American troops often assumed Japanese soldiers would fight to the death, leading to brutal close-quarters combat. But as intelligence operations improved, the U.S. military recognized that psychological warfare could be just as effective as firepower. Specialized units began producing leaflets, written in Japanese, promising humane treatment under international law. Loudspeakers were used during battles to call on isolated troops to lay down their arms. Captured Japanese soldiers were sometimes asked to record messages assuring their comrades that surrender did not mean torture or execution. Safe conduct passes were distributed, guaranteeing food and medical care. These efforts did not produce immediate mass surrenders, but they planted seeds. On battlefields like Saipan and Okinawa, American forces encountered increasing numbers of wounded or starving soldiers willing to give up rather than die in futile charges. Interpreters played a crucial role, reducing fear and confusion at the moment of capture. The consistent application of Geneva Convention standards further reinforced credibility. Over time, word spread. Even in an army bound by strict discipline, information traveled through whispers and observation. When surrender became not only survivable but predictable in its outcome, it gained legitimacy as a choice, especially for those already disillusioned or physically broken. By 1945, the cumulative weight of defeat, starvation, relentless bombing, and psychological strain had transformed the battlefield. During the savage fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, resistance remained fierce, but the number of prisoners taken alive was noticeably higher than in earlier campaigns. Japan's homeland was being devastated by firebombing raids. Cities burned, civilians fled. Supply networks were shattered. Many frontline soldiers understood that the empire they were told was eternal was crumbling. Then came August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki delivered unprecedented destruction, followed by the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan. Finally, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. For soldiers who had been conditioned to believe the emperor was divine, his decision carried immense weight. If the emperor himself accepted defeat, the ideological barrier against surrender dissolved almost overnight. What had once been shameful now became obedience to imperial will. In the final months, surrender rates rose significantly compared to the near-zero levels of 1942. The increase from roughly 1% to as high as 15% in some areas did not signal sudden cowardice. It reflected the gradual collapse of an entire belief system under the relentless pressure of modern industrial warfare. In the end, survival was not simply instinctive. Was the final acknowledgement that the war and the world that demanded death before dishonor had irrevocably changed. In the end, the rise in Japanese surrender rates during World War II was not the result of a single moment, a single battle, or a sudden loss of courage. It was the slow unraveling of a system built on absolute belief. At the beginning of the Pacific War, surrender was nearly unthinkable. Soldiers were conditioned to see it as a stain that would follow their families for generations. They were taught that Americans would show no mercy, that death in battle was purity, and that loyalty to the emperor outweighed the instinct to survive. And for a time, that belief held firm. On beaches, in jungles, and inside volcanic caves, thousands chose death over capture. But wars are not fought in ideology alone. They are fought in hunger, exhaustion, fear, and reality. As Japan's victories turned into defeats, as supply lines collapsed and reinforcements stopped coming, the promise of honorable sacrifice began to ring hollow. Soldiers who were told they were advancing toward glory found themselves abandoned on isolated islands, starving and sick. They witnessed overwhelming American firepower, experienced humane treatment of captured comrades, and slowly realized that the propaganda they had been fed did not fully match the truth. Doubt crept in, and doubt is powerful. By 1945, when cities burned and the emperor himself announced surrender, the psychological wall that once made capitulation impossible had cracked. The increase from roughly 1% to 15% was not just a statistic. It marked the collapse of blind faith under the weight of total war. It revealed that even the most rigid systems can fracture when reality becomes undeniable. The story of those changing surrender rates is not about weakness. It is about transformation under extreme pressure. It shows how belief, fear, leadership, and survival instinct collide in what and how. When an empire falls, even the soldiers taught never to surrender must ultimately face the human desire to live.